everyone. Welcome. This is Gretchen Rowe, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Demi Learning Show. Our mission here is to help families stay in the learning journey wherever it takes them. And today we're going to be talking about grammar as a key to improving writing. I have recruited one of my colleagues who has grammar discussions with me on the regular to join me today to talk about this, because we want to demystify grammar as being something separate from what you're already familiar with doing. I just came back from a homeschool conference, and you'd be amazed at the number of parents who said, I don't want to teach grammar. And we don't think it's that hard. So Ashley and I are going to have a conversation for you to help yourself fit yourself in the frame. And Ashley, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, Gretchen. My name is Ashley Dennison, and I'm the marketing specialist here at Demi Learning. Part of my role, and probably the biggest part of my role, is doing the editing of any of our content that goes out, which includes the blog posts and email newsletters, product descriptions on the website, pretty much anything that is in the written word. But I came to editing through a graphic design background. I went to art school here in Lancaster, PA, started my career as a graphic designer, but I've always had the affinity for the written language, for reading, took every literature elective that was offered to me, and found out that, I loved both of those things. And so at one of my in-house marketing roles, I was able to learn more of the content creation and editing aspect of communications, found that I really like that part better. So now I sort of do a little bit of everything. I'm doing some design work, I do content work. I'm able to put both of those interests together into the broader marketing world.
Yes. And so the reason I recruited Ashley to come have this conversation with me today is because she was instrumental in developing what we call a style guide. In other words, how we say things is important to our customers and to our clientele. And we realized in that first initial conversation about the style guide that we had a lot of things in common. And one of those things in common is that we're not afraid to use lots of words. And so today we want to encourage you that as you begin the academic journey with your children, particularly as they get a little bit older and they have cracked the code of reading, and they have the opportunity to then apply grammar in their processes. And toward that end, it becomes really an interesting proposition when, as parents, we look at grammar as some secret subset of writing. And it's really not. A former colleague of mine, her name is Amy, said, you know grammar, you just don't realize you know grammar. And so today we just want to unpack this for you all a little bit today. Ashley, can we answer the question very first of all about grammar being a key to good writing? You had mentioned it in science and art, and it helps work become clearer. So can you talk in a little bit of depth about that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people get intimidated by grammar, thinking that it's a bunch of rules that they have to memorize, that, it feels like you make a misstep and you don't want to do anything wrong. And I think it's more of a combination. There's a science to editing. There's definitely, grammar rules that are sort of hard and fast. The beauty of that is once you learn the basics of grammar, you've got that. You don't have to keep adding to that or anything. You create that foundation. But there is an art to it. There's a lot, especially when you get into style and tone. There are various ways of doing something, even with punctuation. We'll sometimes here internally talk about, well, should that be an em dash or should we start a new sentence? Little nuances like that become part of the art instincts. So it almost becomes a bit of a puzzle. You are problem solving. You are doing almost like a scavenger hunt sometimes. When I get a piece, I'm thinking, okay, there's got to be areas that can be tweaked, that can be improved upon. Nothing is ever, ready made. But as far as it relates to writing, you really, once you get that grammar background, it frees up a lot of your thinking so that you can just get your ideas onto the paper. Obviously, grammar exists because you want to communicate messages clearly. And if you are muddled or are just completely breaking the rules, you're not going to get your thoughts across. It doesn't always have to be perfect. And in fact, I don't recommend it being perfect as part of the earlier steps of the writing process, which we can talk about later. But you want to sort of release that overthinking of everything needs to be perfect or everything needs to be in place. You need to work towards that. But the more that you implement in your first draft, the easier it's going to be.
And one of the reasons that Ashley and I thought it had merit to have this conversation with a group of families is because so often parents will say to us they're very intimidated by the process of teaching their children grammar. And one of the things that we do in American grammar is we have a degree of subjectability. It's not like math. It's not like it's either right or it's wrong. It's more like yes and. And I remember a couple of years ago, a parent called me and she was having a lengthy argument with one of her teenage sons about the fact that he was trying to put a prepositional phrase where the answer key didn't say it should be. And of course, we know if we've been exposed to grammar and grammar rules that prepositional phrases can move. And I said to her, I'm going to stop you for just a second. Let's take about a 3-foot step back and recognize that your son is arguing with you about a grammatical rule. And he has a version of what he wants. Kudos on you, Mom, because you've created a grammarian. And I think that makes a tremendous amount of difference. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, part of the reason we're having this conversation today is because Demi Learning just rewrote all of the analytical grammar. And I had this conversation over and over again with parents this past weekend in Ohio saying, why did you guys do that? And the real reason is because we want to make it a less intimidating experience. And when you looked at the original analytical grammar notebook, it was a doorstop. I mean, it looked like some of the larger phone books in the bigger cities back when they had phone books. And the truth is, we don't want you to be afraid to help your children learn grammar. Now, interestingly enough, we had several registrants who English is not their first language. And so you are looking at American grammar going, what is wrong with you people? There's nothing wrong with us, but we do make it more complicated. If you come from a background, my foreign language background is German. We had a registrant today who speaks Afrikaans, another registrant who speaks Spanish. All of you have a very regular grammar pattern that your language always follows. We don't have that in English. We're going to let you be a little bit more creative, but it also gives you a larger subjective content to have to address. So, Ashley, can you talk about the fact that basic grammar doesn't change, but language evolves?
Yeah, so there are grammar basics. A noun is a noun, a verb is going to be a verb. There's ways that those pieces of a sentence puzzle can be rearranged and still fit into place. There's things that cannot be moved or that are more steadfast. So learning that comes from that puzzle feeling. I like looking through the AG workbooks and having to identify the words, because that to me is a scavenger hunt aspect. There's going to be elements that you need to learn the variations of, or what the exceptions to rules are. So it can get more complicated. I will admit I don't have everything memorized. I think the number one key is in grammar research and editing is knowing how to look things up, and knowing what the terms are sometimes, because I can't sit here and look at a sentence and go, this feels wrong, but I don't even know where to start to look up how to treat that. So that's where that innate grammar, not that basic grammar knowledge is helpful, because you have the terminology to pull from in order to do further research or to look up discrepancies, whatever it might be, or even just reminders if you haven't dealt with something in a while. I do a lot of looking up things. But then beyond that, language is ever evolving. That's why we have style guides like the Chicago Manual Style or the Associated Press Book Style. They have clear rules about how to handle things, obviously more at a professional setting. But even in the upper grades and even into college, you're expected to follow these style guides that you're not trying to reinvent the wheel. Someone has already struggled through answering this question, decided what is the clearest option for communication, and all you have to do is follow it. But it does change. We are, human beings. There is evolution. Things that were deemed absolutely incorrect before are now, acceptable or alternative uses. It's you see it more in the spoken aspect of it, which is a little bit different than that written, but more or less, you have to look at it through the modern lens. And so that's exciting to me. I think some people might find that frustrating, but there is such power in language and choices that are made that you're sending messages with every little decision, and you want to make sure you're sending the right message. And so therefore, keeping on top of best practices and current usage, really keeps you looking credible, keeps you looking, my biggest thing is trying not to make a mistake. I kind of have that negative worldview where I'm just thinking, how do I not offend someone or not do something that, has gone out of favor? So whether it's, a fear of making a mistake, or whether it's the excitement of adapting, however you want to take it, that's where the style comes in.
And I think one of the things that made this subject doable for me was recognizing that there's not always a right answer. And so those parents who really I want the right answer, sometimes become anxious when they're not sure what that right answer is. And you mentioned something that I want to expound a little bit more on, because when we had our collaboration session to prepare for this, I found this fascinating. And we were talking about the difference between written and spoken grammar. And you gave me an excellent example, and I have been fascinated by that. So now I've had the opportunity, since we had that conversation, to be in 2 different cities and to ask people, so what kind of things are said here locally that might be something that someone doesn't understand in a larger context. So can you bring that example back up? Because I think it's fascinating.
Yes, I will tattle on myself. As much as I love, proper grammar and consider myself fairly knowledgeable, it wasn't until my early 20s I had someone point out to me that I have elements of what I have, I guess, called like more of a Pennsylvania Dutch, or even like a Scotch Irish dialect of dropping the verb to be in my sentences. So I am likely to say, the car needs washed. And that makes perfect sense to me, because to my ears, I know what I'm saying and I know what I'm trying to communicate. To those who don't have that little quirk, they're thinking, well, the car needs to be washed, or it needs washing. So there you're getting into like the verb forms and having the verb and then how that works. And so there's definitely, and I think when you talk to someone and say, oh, what grammar nuances do you not like? Or even, on our Analytical Grammar Facebook page the other week, we said, what do you see your students doing often? And a lot of the answers are stemming from, verb noun agreement or subject verb agreement. And, but it's things that you hear a lot. And I'd be very curious to do the research into how often do those colloquialisms, when do they make it into the written page though? Because a lot of people will self-correct in the written word. Now, obviously there's different scenarios. I have a very academic kind of dry, natural writing style, just coming from more of the college world. And obviously I have to scrub that when writing for social media or a blog post. So you're changing your tone, you're getting a little light-handed on things. But I'm still thinking things that I would maybe say, I have the time to analyze and correct when writing. And so you'll see that a lot, especially early writers tend to just write like they speak. And then as they learn more and as they read more or just engage with people more, then they're able to make the corrections where they might say one thing, but then when they go on paper, that sort of learning kicks in. So I do, I find it funny that immediately people think of grammar tics that are part of speech patterns, and there's a whole realm where you can go and study dialects, and people love to talk about that. I'd love to talk about my husband's influences and the funny pronunciations he has, but it doesn't always appear in writing. And so when you're actually sitting down and starting to form sentences and put things on paper, it can change.
Right. And one of the things I think that is hard for us as parents is to recognize that learning grammar and being able to apply it in the writing process is a process in and of itself. It's not something that a student is going to grasp overnight. They have to practice it. It's a little bit of muscle memory, if you will. And Ashley, one of the things I'd like you to talk about, because this is where I hear parents struggle, is how do you edit a child's writing or a teenager's writing and be that editor without stealing their voice? And I think you do a really good job at this, because you get writing content from all of us here at Demi. We're all flinging stuff at you, and you manage to maintain our voice, but make the grammar fit the occasion. And I think this is a thing that parents don't understand in a lot of instances. This is where our frustration arises. So how do we do that? What makes this doable for parents?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. I'll take compliments. So one of the things that I picked up on is that when I started to really get into editing and figure out the process and how many different levels there are, it really does mirror the different levels of the writing process. And to tie kind of back into my background, the levels and multiple rounds of a design process. You're in all of those things, you're never going to get it right on the first try. There never is just a single perfect pass. And so it's a matter of getting one step closer each time. So
now, I'm going to stop you there for just a hot second, because this is where particularly perfectionists start to hate the writing process, because you just said something really important. There's never just a single pass. How do we get over that understanding of it's gonna take more than one edit?
It's funny because I'm deep diving into research on mindset right now. And so this would tie into that as well, knowing that you need to have that growth mindset of change and growth over time. I think it doesn't need to be frustrating thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to take me multiple tries to get right. I actually think it needs to be an idea of, I need to break this project down into multiple steps, which is a very common concept that is applied to so many different elements of learning. We talk about it in math problems. We talk about it, in anything that you're going to study. Breaking a problem down into smaller digestible steps is so helpful. So for editing and writing, I see the first step would be the developmental step, when you're looking at big picture, major themes, ideas. That's where you're sort of creating a framework. If you're writing, I like to start with, kind of a guide, a template that I'll then go in and fill in details. So when you're writing, you're just trying to get the ideas down. If you're editing, you're reading and seeing, can I read that idea? Can I see what they're trying to say? Is their idea sound? Is their argument flawed? Whatever level you're looking at, whatever level your student is at, you can frame it as, what is the kind of the main goal of that writing assignment, and are they meeting it? Then you move down one more level. So in editing, it's more of the copy editing and line editing element. For writing, it's, more of the sentence refinement. You're looking at syntax, your wording, your phrasing, you're moving things here and there. Again, with the puzzle tie-in, you're taking pieces that might fit better somewhere else and doing some rearranging. And then finally, there's more of the mechanical editing, the proofreading, or for the writing process, I guess you're even more fine tuning if you find things that need even more details, even, that's where you're getting into the, oh, there's a misplaced comma, or I need a comma here because if not, it's changing the meaning. You're working through it, touching on those different ideas. So rather than trying to address everything in one pass and it becomes overwhelming for the editor and for the writer, if you do it in that, like, chop off those little pieces and do it in those chunks, it becomes a better process. It becomes a much better piece.
And, I think as parents, sometimes we have the misapprehension that we have to take that mighty red pen
Yes.
and correct everything all at once. And that can be really discouraging, particularly to an emerging writer. So maybe it would be a good practice as parents to decide, this time we're going to focus on punctuation. And I'm not going to worry about the words that you don't spell correctly. Did I actually say that? Yeah, because writing's the most difficult thing we ask kids to do. It comes down to, how do you sit in the chair to write the words? And we're asking kids to do this very difficult thing. And then we sort of come back, and I'm the good German girl. I came back with all the editing. Yeah, I would turn that thing into a bloodbath with a red pen. And I realized that I was discouraging my kids in the process. And we don't want to be a discouragement to our children. We want them to help see the cup as half full, particularly as they continue to hone their craft of writing. So tell me a little bit, Ashley, for you. I know your kids aren't homeschooled, but they have writing experiences. So what happens when their writing experiences occur and you have to come alongside as their editor?
That's hard, because I can empathize with the homeschooling parents, because I do not like to have to look at their work. I think, I do have the disadvantage of not quite knowing what the focus of that assignment was. Sometimes I need to get that background from them. But I always start at it with, what do you want me to look at? And that helps me figure out where in that level am I coming in on. If they're telling me, my teacher has already been through this multiple times and I just need you to do a final pass, then I'm going to let some things slide, because I'm assuming that it's already been addressed or there's already been a decision made. This goes for work too. If there's something that is glaring, okay, I might flag it to question, but I'm not going to sit there and put everything on the chopping block and say, well, if I would have done it this way. We are past that point. So I'll just do the very light, that's where those grammar rules come in. If is it correct grammar? Is it correct punctuation usage? If so, fine. If not, I will mark it. But if they're coming at me and saying, this is my rough draft, I'm trying to answer this question, okay, we're going to have more of a dialogue. We're going to have more of a conversation about it. If I'm seeing, that they rambled on about something, or if they got into too much detail, but never actually answered the question, I'm going to point that out to them. You do that compliment sandwich. I like that you put this in here. Maybe it belongs somewhere else, but that's a really good thing to point out. You frame it to
I like
help.
that you call it a compliment sandwich. I think that's a nice way to phrase it, so that you're just not busting them on what they have not done well. So
no, and that's a sensitive subject too, because I think so many people think that grammar and editing are hand in hand with being nitpicky. And I admit that there is an element of that to my personality. My husband accuses me of always looking for the negative. And I think it's because I come at it with that idea that everything can be improved upon. So therefore, there is going to be a flaw. And that's why, coming at it with a question first off can be the best. You're not spinning your wheels, fixing things.
I like the way that you said that, though. So can you repeat that question?
Gosh.
Now let me see if I can.
Now you're putting me on the spot.
You said, how do you want me to take a look at this?
Yes.
And I think that's a really cool way to address that. Instead of you're not coming in as the hammer, you're coming in as the encouraging editor, which I think is really cool.
Right. And that's, I mean, I will say that that has been an evolution. I think when I was first starting, I would get too excited about finding things. And, you know, I had coworkers that it was a fun game to try and out edit each other, or to question changes that were made. And, you know, not saying that things were ever wrong, but it was always really nice to get an insight to someone else's thinking process and see, why did you suggest this? Why did you turn this around? So there is that element of that, but not everybody is like that. And that was surprising to me a little bit. You know, writing is such a personal thing, and people really put themselves into it. And we need to respect that and not come at it thinking, I'm the expert, I know better, you need to listen to me. It's very much I mean, it's a conversation. It is a dialogue. It is a collaboration between the writer, the editor, anyone reviewing it, whether it's your student, whether it's a colleague, it's all the same. You know, you need to respect the work that was put into it. You don't want to come in here bragging about all these mistakes that you found when it's actually demoralizing to the person who wrote it. So it's always a teaching experience too. You know, going back to even myself, you know, I might be the editor, but that does not mean that I'm going to hand something off and assume that it's 100% perfect. I mean, that just happened to us the other week, Gretchen, where you pointed out a mistake that I let slide in a blog post. And that's great, because ultimately the goal is to have the best work possible. Once you take a little bit of the ego out of that, you realize it is a collaborative effort. It can take multiple people to really put something out there that is a showstopper.
And you've used a word that I think is really important. And sometimes as parents, we're hesitant to collaborate because we don't want our children to be in the position of thinking we don't know. And
That's true.
if we can set up an environment where we're going to work together for this to be the best production possible, whether it's a paragraph or a lengthy paper, it's going to make a huge amount of difference to our kids. And it's not easy as the parent to say, hey, I don't have all the answers here, but being able to set up the study of grammar as a collaborative experience, I think is a huge game changer. So if parents can reframe that so that their students see it more as an exercise together instead of you're critiquing me, then I think it makes it a lot easier. And you mentioned something when we were preparing for this 2 weeks ago about the triangle and flipping the triangle to be able to have that conversation with kids, to focus on the large stuff and then get down to the minutia. And I wondered if you could, because that I think is probably going to be a surprising revelation for parents. And I'd love for you to talk about that in a little bit more depth.
Yeah, well, first, let me touch on what you had said about the being able to admit that you don't have all the answers. And that is a process. And I think that really ties into your relationship with your child. You know, I've always tried to keep a level of humility to my children, to anything, because letting them see me, apologize if I make a mistake. And that just ties into that idea of, I have more experience than you, and I have literally studied this, but I'm not going to be perfect. And so there is, they have the freedom and the confidence to then maybe make questions. I will say there have been times when I've said, you've just got to trust me on this one. You are wrong on this. We get into a little bit of a battle of wills sometimes, but I like that they have that questioning process, because that is going to serve them well. I try and challenge them to go seek out an answer. I say, okay, if you're disagreeing with me, show me something that backs up your side. Show me where this is being done, or whatever the case might be. So, Yeah, I didn't really think of it in those terms before, but I think that's definitely helpful. As far as so then flipping the pyramid, flipping the triangle, that goes back to the hierarchy that I had outlined in the writing and editing process, where you go from either, the big picture down to the details. But I fear that some people, when going, start with the little details. They are, especially you had mentioned the perfectionist. I am a very typical perfectionist. I cannot get started looking at a blank page. I remember being in school and just staring at it going, I don't know where to start, and wanting to make sure that everything looked perfect and everything was in its right spot. And if I made a mistake, heaven help us, it's all going to the trash can and we're starting fresh. So that a lot of that just has to come with practice and a lot of parental encouragement to remind them that mistakes are part of the learning process. Mistakes are okay. Mistakes are where you learn. If I love the term sloppy copy, because anyone who writes on paper knows that you're going to end up with rips and eraser marks. And, if you take it to the digital world, some of our first drafts of blogs and whatnot are littered with crossouts and comments. And, you look at those changes, the tracked changes on the document, and it can get really messy, really sloppy. But we get insight into other people's thinking processes. Other collaborators point out things that we ourselves may have missed. And so for the student, it might take a while to get them out of that need to have everything look perfect right away. I'm sure, there's plenty of ways that you can help encourage them to get out of that and to intentionally make mistakes. I know for my son, we had gotten him a journal that was specifically meant to be messy and multimedia and, not a perfect specimen. And that has helped him in his creative expression to know that this one didn't turn out how I wanted, but I'm not going to scrap it. I'm moving on and I'm going to make refinements. So it might have to start there and work your way through rather than completely just automatically flipping it, however you want to go about it, but keeping that pyramid shape and thinking, how are we addressing this? Where are we in that process? And where does my student need to be right now?
Right. And, I think one of the hardest things as a parent, if you have a child with those perfectionistic tendencies, you've said it, the blank piece of paper just screams at you. It is so very hard. And, I have been a blogger and a writer for a number of years, and the most valuable tool I have found is my phone. Because when I begin to write a blog, I have lots of thoughts, but I get hung up in the mechanics of getting the details down. And then the thoughts escape me. And I think, now, what is it that I wanted to say about that? I don't remember. So it's so easy as a parent to take your phone, open up an email, hit that microphone button, and start from there. Say, tell me a story. And that allows your child to capture the thoughts. And for those perfectionistic kids where that's the first pass and they think, oh no, I don't want to do more than one pass. If you've got a copy that you can edit, it becomes so much easier to make that editing decision and make it possible to do that in an encouraging way. And I know one of the questions that we had from a parent, which I highlighted because I love this, is, how do I make this fun? My son likes reading. I don't know how to get this to be more fun. And you mentioned something today. You've mentioned it once and you mentioned it in our conversation, but you talk about it being a puzzle. So can you talk a little bit about how do you make that puzzle element stand out for a student?
Yeah, so I like puzzles and brain teasers and games and all sorts of things. And so I think my brain sort of went right to that and making parallels and turning things around. And there's multiple ways of doing that. For the writing process, I think of it as almost building blocks, like you are building a you know, a set of something, or, you know, using blocks to put things together where you need a strong foundation, and then you go on to details and whatnot. And so, you know, my blogging process, which first of all, I will say, I 100% prefer to edit someone's writing, because starting from scratch is not my strong point. I'm much more I'm happier to take someone's work and finesse it and fine tune it and mold it. But man, to have to come up with those thoughts, I mean, it is definitely a challenge. And I think, you know, never lose sight of that, and never stop reminding your students that even getting the stuff on the page is the hardest part, of the biggest mountain to climb. But I like to start with the main ideas, like you had said. I'll sort of just have a brain dump, throw sentences out there. And those are my big chunks. Those are the big elements. And then I will go and break them down or add more things, like, okay, if I want to talk about this, these are the 3 elements that support that. I mean, it goes into a formula. It's just like, you know, you talk about writing, you know, the 5-paragraph essay, and there's a formula to follow. And I like that aspect of it. And I think that might be helpful to those who get worried by the blankness. You know, let's put that formula into place. Let's put that template into place. When I'm writing something that is repetitive, I actually will, you know, save keyboard shortcuts, where I can start with, I'll throw something on the page in that template, and suddenly I've got headers, or even if it says header 1, header 2, whatever, it doesn't even have to have any context to it, but it becomes less intimidating because I've now got spaces to fill. It becomes like a fill in the blank, which is the thing that students tend to like. They like you know, think of Mad Libs, think of something where there's that puzzle element of, there's a hole, I must fill it. So we are going to put, you know, this comment, this thought, this idea, where is it going to fit within my template? Oh, what's another one that I like? Well, from the editing aspect, that's where it feels like hunting down things. Especially when it comes to proofreading. If I'm told that something is ready to publish, that it is done deal, that's a challenge to me. I will go and go, but is it really? And go through and look, and I will check every punctuation. I will check, especially, you know, for us, for the style guide, we have ways to style our products, ways that we refer to certain elements of our curriculum. So making sure that those all adhere and fit the way that they need to be. I'm always trying to sniff out one or so errors, and sometimes I come up short, and that's great for everybody involved, but it's more fun to find something.
No, I had a conversation this weekend with a mom in Ohio who said, how do you feel about the Oxford comma? And I giggled because I thought, oh, this would be interesting. And I thought, do I give her my opinion, or do I ask why she's asking?
Right?
And I fortunately said, and why would you ask me about that? Because she said, well, I think it's just a waste of time. And I always think about examples of where you really needed it, but you didn't have it. Like,
Find them all over, all those funny, it becomes unintentionally comical.
right.
Or,
so maybe for our listeners, we should expound on what we're talking about here and why it's important. It's that comma before the and. And so maybe I'm trying to think of my favorite one is a picture of Rachel Ray on the cover of a magazine, and it says something about she loves cooking, eating, and family. And the way it reads is the comma was missing, so it sounds like she's cooking and eating her family.
yes, I just pulled that up real quick. It says Rachel Ray finds inspiration in cooking her family and her dog. No comma anywhere. So it's not even an Oxford comma issue. That is a comma in general issue.
So these kinds of things, if you can teach your children to play with words, able to find those things. So back to the parents' question, how do I make it fun? if you've made a grammar experience part of the academic experience, then it becomes fun when they start finding these kinds of mistakes. And I
Yes.
think that makes it more entertaining and less arduous.
Well, it kind of ties into, this time of year, everyone's excited about Easter egg hunts. And if you think about it, you could present your student with a sentence or a paragraph and say, there are X number of changes that need to be made in here. Can you find it? So it becomes that challenge aspect. And, you make sure that you leave it to things that are in fact grammatical or punctuation errors. You don't want to really mess with them by doing the things that are more subjective or stylistically appropriate. Issues of redundancy can be sort of a gray area, but having them adhere to the things that they've learned really helps. I think that you could always turn it into a game rather than it feel like you just, hand them a book and say, this is what you're doing. It can become a collaborative thing. There can be, celebratory moments when they find one, maybe they've been struggling with a certain thing, and then they start to find them through every element of it. There's growth in there.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that is important for us to outline for parents is this is not something that happens overnight. You have to be willing to engage in a process to teach your children how to be grammatically correct. And sometimes that requires us as parents to be attentive to our own grammar and how we say things, and not be afraid to say, I've been saying this the wrong way for a really long time, and I need you to help me be accountable to changing how I'm saying that. And I'm thinking, my father, his first language was not English. And he followed German grammar rules with American English no matter what. And it led to some very funny experiences because he was applying rules in the context of where our grammar in American English is much more subjective. But he was pretty strident in the rules are the rules, and you must do it this way. So Ashley, how does a parent who has had no experience with grammar, where do they pick it up? And this kind of goes back to a little bit of analytical grammar and why we break it down into elemental components. Can you talk about, if you're a parent beginning, like with your younger children, you're not going to be as intentional as a parent with an older child. So where do we start? Really identifying the parts of speech, or?
I mean, for the step one is just read a lot. You're going to pick up so much, and your students will pick everything up through the innate exposure. Just have the exposure to it, and they will learn what sounds right and doesn't sound right. It kind of goes back to that idea of internalizing it, and you're going to speak a certain way, and that's most students' first experience with any of the grammar instruction, because they will know that this sounds right, and if someone switches this, then I'm confused. They might not know why, they won't know the reasons, but they will be confused. So just reading a variety of things to your student, having conversations about what you're doing, getting them involved in day-to-day life, that allows them to have different ways of speaking. So if you think about it, if you're carrying on a conversation about what you're doing today, that's a narrative. But then when you are helping them through a household chore, suddenly you're giving like instructions. There has to be a step-by-step element, and that has to have a lot of clarity to it, because you don't want them, if you say, if you're cooking and you say, put the egg in the flour. Well, are you putting the whole egg, or are you going to crack the egg into the flour? That exposes the importance of word choice matters, being very specific, and how specific. But then from there, there's so much that you already know. And so you can introduce the easiest things, like you had said, are parts of speech, particularly verbs and nouns. You know, you can get even deeper level wise, but don't hesitate to refresh your own instruction. I mean, I'm someone who calls herself an editor, and yet I flip through the analytical grammar books and will like test myself on sentences, or will look at a section again that I can get tripped up on. I specifically, during the recent revamp of it, there was something, and I off the top of my head cannot remember what it was, but there was something that was throwing me off. I think it might have been verb or adjective order. How do you do an appropriate order of adjectives? And there's some tests that you can do. And a lot of it does come down to, well, if you're a native English speaker, sometimes it just sounds right and sometimes it doesn't. But there was a secondary test, and I remember emailing Amy and saying, are we addressing this alternative method of doing it? And she said, yes, we plugged that in there. So there's tips and tricks, but you know, you can always use a refresher if something is a sticking point for you. Even just being aware of what those sticking points can be, so that you will remind yourself to look something up or double check before, you know, passing something down or whatnot.
You know, there's some things like adjective order. Didn't we write a blog about this? Do I remember this? Or did we have a conversation about maybe this, I might be blending conversations, and it was an internal conversation about adjective order. You don't say the red big ball, you say the big red ball.
Yeah.
And we as native English speakers are used to doing that. You know, a German speaker would say the big ball red because the color would come after the noun. So, you know, it's kind of interesting to explore that. And this comes back to that puzzle piece. Find it as a puzzle. And if you can, particularly with your perfectionistic students, they can look at it as, this is a puzzle I have the opportunity to address and to learn from. I think it makes it a lot less painful. It maybe takes the sting out of it a little bit. So.
Right. And I think that goes back to something that you had pointed out in our brainstorming session about how when you're talking about spoken language, there's more of a, it's brief, it happens quickly, you get a sense of what's happening, you carry on the conversation, but then you move on. You're not sitting there and analyzing everything. And you're picking up a lot in the nonverbal communication with your body language, your tone, you know, the way that you're speaking, the way that you're putting pauses into your language or into your conversation. You know, I make mistakes verbally all the time because my thoughts are happening. They have to translate through the mouth. They get out there, we move on. Well,
and sometimes we're so busy talking, trying to get the thoughts out, that we don't self-edit it along the way. So.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure I'm going to go back and rewatch this webinar, maybe never, but if I did, I would cringe at probably some of the conversational things I have said that do not fit
I think you've done a fantastic job. And I should say, for our listeners, as an aside, I dragged Ashley into this kicking and screaming, but she was willing to have this conversation with me, because when you walk in the editorial world, as she does every day, it becomes second nature to you. But as parents, some of us are very reluctant to step into that editorial world. And Ashley makes it seem so easy. I thought it would be great to bring her along for the conversation. So,
well, thanks. But even, I want to impress upon the fact that even a professional here still has imposter syndrome. There's still a lot of I will sometimes encounter something and go, wow, I could not give you an example of that, or I don't even know how to define that. Does that make me a fraud? Does that mean I don't know grammar? No, it just means that it's something that I don't think about on a day-by-day basis. I might still be able to flag it as wrong when reading through material because of that innate instinct of this doesn't read right, this doesn't feel right, but I can't always tell you why something's wrong. I would have to go to a manual, go to some sort of reference material, look it up and say, okay, it is because it is this type of phrase and that doesn't belong here, whatever the situation might be. So I hope, that should be helpful to parents thinking, no one has it all memorized. And if they do, it's because they are in the weeds day in and day out and live, eat, and breathe it. Just
Well,
like anything.
I loved what you said about the struggle is real between correcting grammar and having friends.
Yeah. There's that part of me that wants to, if you get those, in writing, you kind of have like those eagle eyes where mistakes jump out at you. Verbally, things will be said that you kind of cringe when you hear it, because it's not correct, or might be a certain dialect that you're unfamiliar with, and a certain way of doing things. And my advice is to let it go in most cases. I have the unfortunate side effect of correcting my children because I want them to learn, but now I have a child who corrects me, and that's not fun. He will nitpick me. And of course, it's usually, think about it. If you are in a high emotional moment, whether, someone's misbehaving and you're scolding them, you don't want your oldest child telling you that you just said something incorrectly, and it kind of takes the sting out of what you're trying to say. It deflates you a bit. Not the time or place.
I'm sure there's not a parent who's going to listen to this who has not experienced that. So,
yeah. There's that juxtaposition of pride that he recognized it as being incorrect, but also not now. Okay,
not now.
And also the embarrassment of needing to teach the nuances of, that is how someone is speaking because that is how they grew up and that is correct to them. So don't be that person that is, correcting them or making remarks or whatnot. That goes back to just a broader idea of language, which is a whole other conversation. But language there's a lot of beauty in it, and while something might seem wrong to you, if you take the time to actually do research and find out the background of why this occurs or why this segment of population uses this construction, it ties into so many aspects of human life. It ties, in America, in the English, grammar rules that you were stating, we're a country that's a melting pot. And so we're taking different influences from all of these other languages. The words come from other languages. You have verbs that conjugate differently because they have different root words that come from Greek versus Latin. And sometimes conversations here in the office can get rather academic and you learn a lot. Sometimes it goes way over my head because I realize that those are nuances that don't affect how I can or cannot edit something. But if you're interested in that type of stuff, you can really go down a rabbit hole. I like learning it from a geographical standpoint, sociological standpoint. How do people use these things? And again, a lot of that is verbal because, you're picking up on the way that it's said and the tone that it's said. When it gets translated into a written method, you really do have to focus on those details because, as you had said, the details matter more because they're all you have.
Right. And you had said something when we prepared for this about the difference between editing for clarity and conciseness. And I think this is something where parents get, as my dad used to say, the horse before the cart, which is obviously not the right order of words. What he meant was the cart before the horse, but it's the same understanding of how as a parent do we need to look for the difference between clarity and conciseness. So
yeah, I think that goes to the two different steps. Clarity is going to be a bigger idea, concept of, am I understanding you correctly? Am I interpreting it? It's almost like an interpretation. You think about comma usage and some of this punctuation, and some of it can be very subjective and commas optional. Sometimes that changes the entire meaning of the sentence. And so if you're speaking it, it might become clear because you're going to emphasize a certain word, or you're going to frame your voice a different way. When you're in writing, you need to really say, is this telling me the right fact Or am I getting, sometimes it can be the complete opposite, and that obviously changes the meaning and it will confuse readers completely. So once you have that down, then it's a matter of streamlining. And that's something that I struggle with because, as you said, I am a more of a wordy person naturally. So I don't always recognize it in others either, because I'm looking at this sentence and it makes sense to me and it sounds fine. But someone else might read it and go, wow, you can cut 50% of those words and I still understand it. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, okay. So that goes into that idea of I need to be in the right mindset of what exactly am I looking for, because that primes your brain to pick up on those things more. Even editing, if it's the same piece, sometimes I will do several separate passes myself before handing back to the writer for another attempt. Because I want to say, okay, this time I'm going to look at the big idea. This time I'm going to look at, are these word choices? Then I'm going to do the punctuation, then send it back to them, approve the changes. It can take some
It's a
time.
back and forth. Yes. And, I know we have parents who are going to listen to this or are listening today going, wait a minute, you're talking to me about editing for conciseness when I can't get the words out of my kid's head in the first place. So I think it's easier to get a child to pare it down after they've put it on paper than it is to expect conciseness in the process of writing. And this is why nobody writes a first draft that's a final draft. And I think that makes it a tremendous amount of difference. And we're almost to the top of the hour, but I want to visit one more question because I don't know that we have been explicit about this, and that is diagramming is to sentence structure as calculations are to math. So why is there virtue in us doing sentence diagramming?
Okay, so another point where I always feel a bit of an imposter because I am not good at diagramming sentences. And that is something that I enjoy doing and would like to work on in my abundance of free time that I have.
You're a mother. There is no free time. Let's get it straight.
It's been on my want to do list for so long. No, especially for people who are very visual. I love that diagramming sentences puts things into an order. There is a rhyme and a reason. There is a rhythm that you can get into. There are slots to be filled, as we talked about earlier. It can be so helpful to people who need to move things around. And, while words might not be as tactile as, let's say math manipulatives, diagramming is still a way to take some of those ideas of moving things around. How do they relate to each other? How do I see this in a different way in order for it to click? And, the more tools that you have, the more tools that your student has when conquering a challenge, the better prepared they're going to be. So while they may not want to diagram everything because that would just be really drag them down, who's to say that they might not come across something more challenging and be able to search their toolbox and say, I'm really confused as to why my writing isn't working, or I'm confused as to why this sentence is not conveying what I need it to convey. Then they can go back and try a different method, diagram it, through it to figure out what's missing, what's out of place, what is not working. It just helps to take something that, when you're writing it, we write in a very linear fashion. It doesn't get crazy. Maybe, once you're editing on paper, there might be notes and scribbles, but to diagram the sentence puts it into, whether you want to say into more of a puzzle aspect, into a visual aspect, it just breaks that mold that they're used to of that familiar pattern and has a different way. It's viewing a problem with a twist. So you're looking at it from a different angle.
And I think that is, we had talked about this puzzle aspect. That's where the puzzle aspect really becomes concrete to be able to help a student really understand. So I want to encourage parents. I know I've had parents say to me over the years, oh, I'll do anything but sentence diagramming. frankly, I'd rather do sentence diagramming than long math problems, but that's just me. We're thankfully we all come to the table with a different set of skills. And I think that makes a tremendous amount of difference. Ashley, we're at the top of the hour. This conversation has gone really quickly and I've had a great deal of fun. What are some clothing? Yeah. Okay. Let's get the word right. What are some closing thoughts that you would have for our parents to take away from our conversation today?
I just think it's important to not be intimidated. And I know that sounds simple. I know it's easier said than done. But to remember that every challenge that you've had in this homeschooling journey has been conquerable. This is just yet another one. We all come in with our own biases and preferences. And I understand that as someone who loves grammar, that makes me an anomaly. So it is, sort of silly, but I'm with you where some of the math problems that just make my eyes cross, I would much rather read through and go through. So we're all going to have our natural preferences, but just try and keep the positive outlook because your student's going to pick up on that. Find what excites them about it. Try the different ways of practicing, try the different tools and see what lights them up and then explore that further. I loved your statement about the audio. I forgot about that. Like a lot of people will dictate first, then transcribe it to work on it. That makes it less intimidating. So whatever works for your student and, be ready for multiple because we know that everyone's different. That always multiplies your work, but it's never truly done. You can always keep moving
Right.
and getting better each time. And I love to look back and see the growth pattern with students. And I mean, particularly myself, I look at some of the earlier things and I go, wow, I can't believe that made it through. But, it's just like anything else, it's a skill to be developed.
Absolutely. And toward that end, I want to encourage parents to do a couple of things. First of all, we talked about using your phone as a first draft tool and being able to capture your students' thoughts without the difficulty of having to hold a pen and sit in the chair and think of what they want to say and spell it and punctuate it, yada, yada, yada. I think that's a great methodology. The other thing I want to encourage parents to do is to hold on to those writing experiences. And by that, I mean that if you're going through compositional writing this year and it's April, pull out those compositions that they wrote last September, because there's nothing more encouraging to a writer than to see how their writing evolves. And that makes a tremendous amount of difference. And I will also say, as the parent of now adult children, if you hold on to those writing experiences, they are some fiercely funny moments for those adult kids to revisit. And I want to encourage you to be able to do that with your students. We've reached the end of the time. This is Gretchen Rowe for the Demi Learning Show. Thank you so much for joining us today. You can access the show notes on our blog, or you can find the recording at demilearning.com/show, or you can also find it on our YouTube channel. Be sure to rate, review, follow, subscribe wherever you may be hearing this, especially if you really enjoyed it. Ashley, thanks again for your time, and we hope you enjoy your writing journey. Take care, everyone.